I just spoke to Jim Rutt for about an hour and a half. This is going to be the summary of our call. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about Jordan Hall quite a bit, and how Civium has changed over time, and how, Jim has worked with Jordan extensively about the ideas behind Civium. I tried to break down the ideas behind cognitism as simply as I could by placing them in relationship to other concepts. Let me just read what I read to him at the beginning of the conversation. If you want to contextualize cognitism, then you should activate the following concepts in your brain and then place it in relationship to them: wisdom of the crowd, information theory, democracy, machine learning, semiotics, neurobiology, psychology, prediction markets, sociology, the scientific process, connectomics, and memetics. It was a much denser conversation than my conversation yesterday, and it just covered so many areas that I think it's a bit difficult to even summarize. Robin Hansen, I believe he's of Futarchy, and I believe he's the guy associated with prediction markets, was brought up, and we talked about just keeping track of your perceptions of truth over time. He did say at one point that he thought my ideas were immature, which obviously I disagree with. I think they're very, very, very far refined, and more so than almost anybody else's. I just think that I'm not that good of a communicator, and I was not able to communicate succinctly what I was talking about to him. And I also said that early in the conversation that that was what I thought was going to happen, is that there was going to be this sense that there wasn't a there because of my inability to communicate well. It's always frustrating to me when people will say something like, your ideas aren't mature. I was like, no, they all connect. You're just not taking the time to really dig deep down into them. And I know the moment that thought set into his mind, well, I don't know, but I felt the change when he asked me a specific question that I really wanted to answer about how the process of iterating in relationship to the algorithm worked, and I got distracted and started going into all these topics, and I didn't give him a very concise answer. But I did stop at one point to say, okay, well, what the token actually is a distribution of attention at that particular moment based off of what information is being amplified by the network of all of these different knowledge stores in, their relationship to each other. That the token in the system was just a distribution of attention. Now, he didn't understand that immediately, and I said, okay, it would need more time to contextualize and explain that. So I didn't leave that thing like, he understands cognitism. Definitely not. I do think that people seem to think that if an idea isn't connecting in their brain when I'm saying it, it means it doesn't connect in my brain, which is completely illogical and nonsensical. I'm genuinely not surprised that his responses, they felt immature and not thought through. It's a response that I get all the time when I can't get through the answers to the questions quickly or accurately enough, and we just ran out of time. He communicated to me that he thought I was a smart individual, which is nice. And obviously there's just a great deal of alignment on a lot of topics related to tracking perception over time and other people who had done it. And I talked to him a bit about how I really felt like some voices who were disconnected from these groups need to be amplified, and that I felt that the people who are most likely to have actual systems that would function are not the people that are going to be heard. And so there needs to be an active effort by people who have this institutional power, whose voices are magnified and who are hot nodes in the community, to really seek out these smaller voices and amplify them even before, they feel like those ideas are important. He also shared the manifesto right before the meeting, which I was like, oh fuck, how do I contextualize this? We talked about how I thought what should have happened at the end of their meetings. I think they're called the Stanton meetings. I don't know. It was what resulted in Game B, was that they should have very discreetly, they should have all expressed their views very clearly and written them down in the distance of them so that they could see how those beliefs are changing over time. And he told me that Thor Muller suggested they did that via GitHub or Git, and that he disagreed or wasn't interested by that. And, he's not as much as interested in keeping track of his beliefs over time because they're constantly evolving. Or that the getting from point A to point B where he would actually have that system would not be interesting in him to do the work. He also seemed to think that you couldn't accurately capture a representation of your views over time, despite the fact that we share our beliefs online every day, and I have a representation of his beliefs in my mind. We also talked about that this sort of algorithmic representation of who we are is already happening, and that the only way that I was able to interface with him and connect with him is because the algorithms on YouTube and Twitter understand who Jim Rutt is, what Jim Rutt is associated, and was able to make the connection between my work and him as an individual, right? So we're already interfacing with these algorithmic representations of our beliefs. I'm just saying we should have exposed that so that you can more directly correct it. You know, he talked about wanting explainability behind AI, and I was like, well, what if you had, I didn't say this, but I'm thinking this now. What if you could go and directly interrelate with this algorithm that is distributing the representation of Jim Rutt? If you can go in, it's like the model explains what it thinks your beliefs are, and you can shape them to the present. That was sort of an analogous thing to the way that I was framing cognitism. He's very nice and fun and clever, and it was a really, really enjoyable conversation. I just got a text from Jordan. The text said that the modes were fundamentally distinct, because I was asking him why he was not rolling together the supply chain representation, knowledge representation in Civium together with the serendipity engine and the project proposal structure, because I view the cognitive data stream is analogous to all of those three things in one. So he was just responding to that question. Back to Jim. My takeaway from Jim is I really liked him. I'd like to talk to him again. I know that I'm not the best communicator about my own ideas, and that I can stumble across my own words. That does not mean they're not complete or internally and externally consistent. It just means that I stumble across my words a lot, and there's a fucking reason why it's Speaker John Ash. You know, I have something to say, and I'm not the best communicator. I'm doing my goddamn fucking best. You know, there's a manifesto. There's 60 plus videos I've interfaced via these tweets. I have 70,000 of my thoughts in the development of these ideas stored. You can scan through them. There really is a there. But for me to be able to convince players that there is a there. I personally think that we're wasting time, like a lot of it. And a lot of the time is being wasted because of egos, right? That's why I'm just sending texts to Jordan. I'm like, okay, what if Civium was like this? What if you did Civium a little bit differently? And questioning and prodding, are all of these ideas internally consistent, and will they play out in the way that you expect them to? You know, it's a crazy thing to try to develop a meme that is going to exist outside of you, especially outside of you after your own death, right? And it's a crazy idea to believe that when you take that meme and put it into another mind, it's going to grow a tree of knowledge that is true to seed and bear fruit that is true to seed, that your representation after watching this video or any of my content is going to map to cognitism. I understand that. That's built into the process. So I hope I get to talk to him more about all of these monetary systems and machine learning. He's very well informed on the whole stack, right? And so we're in a very, very similar space. And there was a lot that we agreed upon. I really enjoyed it. I was talking about the importance of having a record to hold one accountable to one's beliefs when one felt that they're worthy of putting their word, staking their word against their beliefs over time. And that using that signal of the way that collective belief is shifting over time, the fact that the Overton window shifts, and the fact that there are individual beliefs relative to the Overton window, to me says that you can use the signal of being ahead of the curve collectively to amplify voices, right? And so the examples, they had these, I think they're called Stanton, whatever meetings they had, the Game B meetings, I'm going to call them, the Avengers of Sense Making, when they came together, that they were very ahead of the curve. They were thinking of things before anybody else was thinking about them. And it really would have been nice to have this record of all those beliefs so it didn't just exist privileged in their minds, right? Nobody can access that except for them. It's this in-group thing. They cannot access the discussions that led to the creation of Game B. And so there really has emerged this cult of personality where everybody is orienting themselves around these voices because, they want to know their insight. They did not keep track of those conversations and why they developed as they did. So a lot of the conversation was just me trying to justify this idea that if you have this collective record of belief, it can be a very, very powerful thing. And then you have to connect in all of those different parts of how it would actually function. And because of the complexity, I think he felt like it was unrealized. And I'm like, do you know how much complexity goes into securing the monetary token? Do you know how much complexity goes into the security behind computers? The mere fact that one person can build out the ideas that I am suggesting, even though they're extraordinarily complex, is heartening, because one person cannot really build out the entirety of the economic system. One person couldn't even build out Bitcoin at that time, right? It was a team of developers, supposedly, or people claim it was a team of developers. So I think if there was a point of contention, it would be the disagreement about the value of a collective record of our beliefs over time, despite that he believed that people should be held accountable to their beliefs. And he was very much of the belief that people should be held accountable to their claims. That's what he told me, that in the Game B groups, there was a real effort to hold people accountable to their claims. So I think so we agreed there, but the idea of actually having a formalized record, my takeaway is that he's not sold on that yet, or does not believe that any sort of formalized record is good, or that he might use it if somebody else makes one, but he's not going to go put his efforts into it. And I would say that that's actually the fundamental thing that we need to solve the problems, right? A way for us to stake our word over time. And without that, you will not solve the Game B. So that's what I think is the ultimate point of contention between me and Jim after that conversation, is the level of importance for collective record. And the second disagreement is whether my ideas were fully realized. And I believe they are. I didn't communicate well enough, and it was too short a time, and I think he thinks it isn't because I look like I'm fucking 24, and because I stumble over my words. Even though early in the meeting, I'm like, this is what's going to happen. Predicting, it's so funny when I predict people's behaviors. And anyways, we disagree about some things. We agreed on a lot. He's very well educated and understands almost all of the foundation. He didn't touch on things like wisdom of the crowd, which I think needs to be more in the Game B space. People need to be talking about wisdom of the crowd more. People need to be talking about information theory a lot more. People need to be talking about machine learning a lot more. I did mention different ways of doing AI governance, and no ideas came to his mind. I was like, what? There's 1,000 ways to do AI governance. So I don't know if I just proposed that question wrong. We also just talked about the errors in transmission of meaning from one mind to the other. So there was a big theme, I really feel like I can't fully transmit cognitism to anybody's mind. I also don't feel that Engels could have perfectly communicated communism to any person's mind, or that, there's never going to be a system where everybody agrees on the definition of capitalism. And if you want to do new system designs, you have to take that into account. If you do not take that varying level of definitions and representations about what things are into account into your system design, then it's just going to be people wanking off, and just when they turn out to be wrong, clearly so, not accepting or updating their prior beliefs or having any sort of accountability to the actions that they were taking based off of those beliefs in the future. I genuinely believe that there are going to be people who are just going to be dirty, 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 dirty liars, and right now we have no way to hold them accountable to their word. He asked me to sort of simulate walking through if there had been a six-stanton meeting and if they'd used this software, and I think I stumbled across that because I was being too literal about the way that played out. Because the way that played out is that they didn't talk for a while. So if I'm saying okay, this cognitive thing requires an iterative relationship with the model, but we're talking about them just completely stopping and not doing another meeting, right? So I got stuck on that. And so it took me a second to bring back, like, no, in iteration with these, what if you had stayed together? I know I'm not the best communicator. That's why I'm having these calls with people. And hopefully, as I do more calls with these people, I'm going to get clearer and clearer and clearer. And then hopefully that when I, have these future conversations with, Jordan and Jim, they start to get it more and it starts to connect more, because I don't view as either of their distaste with the ideas to be based off of anything other than they don't fully understand, right? The number of questions I think that we're aimed at disseminating the ideas behind there were intentional to get to the fucking core of cognitism, as when I talked to Andrew Somerville, the performance artist at a random party. Andrew is the only person I have ever Andrew is the only person I've ever spoken to that took the time to really dig down to fully understand what I was saying. And by the end, I felt like he knew what I was talking about. And his main point of contention was that he believed that there were non-causal things that came from people's minds, and that machine learning would never have that. I'm like, well, I don't want a machine learning model to do something that is completely non-predictable and just out of the blue. That sounds kind of dangerous, right? So it was like he understood, but there was a point of contention about the fundamental nature of these tools, which is another thing, which is like when I talk about these generative models, like, well, sometimes it doesn't make sense. I'm like, good, you don't want a conscious agent involved in your fucking government that's artificial. Jesus Christ, do not embed agents in reality and give them the power of action. But if you have a system where its only purpose is to reflect back the beliefs of the community over time towards people in this sort of iteration where it's like you're learning collaboratively with an algorithm, and that algorithm is learning collaboratively with the community and trying to represent a central belief, I think that's a really powerful thing. And if you're not taking that idea into consideration for Game B seriously, we're not going to make it through Transition B at all. We'll collapse, right? If you want to talk about like what works for the next 1,000 years, not next 10 years, you have to think a little bigger. You have to think, well, machine learning is probably going to be foundational to the future of humanity, and it's therefore foundational to a lot of aspects, all aspects of how we're interrelating with the world. So the mere fact that I hear so few people playing in this field of representational learning for Game B is very concerning to me, and it's why I'm trying so hard to talk with a lot of people and educate them on these ideas. Unfortunately, I'm not the best communicator, which is why I'm trying so hard to reach Daniel, because I feel like if I speak to Daniel Schmachtenberger in person and I reflect those ideas upon him, he will reflect them back upon me in a way that is compressed, clearer, and more succinct than I can. And then I can use that compression to better contextualize when I'm talking to other people. Another thing that Jim mentioned when I mentioned that they should have tracked the dissonance in their beliefs for later reference based off, like what happens, because time seems to reveal the truth very naturally. But then a lot of people like to pretend they didn't say things in the past that are contrary to what is common knowledge now. And he told me that actually Thor Muller, who was the guy who originally suggested the Game B, or at least that's how Jim remembers it, also suggested that they track this dissonance in their belief, and they use a Git-like structure to track the changes over time. I then mentioned that the idea of tracking the dissonance between, belief through a Git-like structure was what I viewed as the most common idea related to the Game B space that just continues to be emergent. Like, somebody structured the U.S. Constitution via Git, and people have tried to put law through that system. And so I would say that there may be a reason that has emerged, especially when you have to consider if the future of, collective decision making is actually, factually, software, then, you're going to have to and want to keep a record of those code changes over time. And so structure like Git just makes sense. I don't necessarily think that for the actual knowledge being encoded, that is the proper structure, obviously, because I'm suggesting something completely different. But I thought it was very interesting that somebody, in fact, did suggest they do it, and is the person that Jim thinks is the person who named Game B. So now I really want to talk to Thor Muller because I'm curious what makes him so prescient. The topic of the memeing of Game B video came up, even though he hadn't seen it, which is that the reason why those original talks fractured was that there was a disagreement about the fact that it should be focused on personal development or it should be focused on institutional things. And he very early on in the conversation made the correction and said, no, it's got to be both. It needs to be a synthesis of both of these perspectives. And he's like, well, why didn't we see that from the beginning? Weirdest part of the experience was as soon as I logged off the call, I got a notification of somebody saying that Jim Rutt had posted the manifesto and that he disagreed with most of it, but it was interesting. And I got that from 3 separate people. One was a comment and 2 texts. And I did not get that sense at all from the conversation. I feel like there are very few people in this world that I am greatly aligned with in terms of how we are thinking about systems and how people interact with each other. And he's like top 5 conversations I've ever had of people understanding me. And he posted that thing before we even talked. And obviously he didn't read a 100-page manifesto. There's not really a lot to disagree in the particular manifesto because a lot of what is in there is just a history of sense-making. Like, the scientific method and democracy and religion and it's just the ways that we have interfaced with what we believe to be true over time. So basically the history of sense-making. And there's a small section that suggests a potential future way to do it. And there is an intro that basically is the Declaration of Independence recontextualized for the modern era. And so there are like a few small things, but when we started the conversation, the first thing that I did was I read this quote, which I can't pull up right now. I guess I'll record once I'm back inside. And this video will be a weird cut of place to place to place. But I read this quote, which says, before discussing the proposed system of decentralized self-governance itself, we present 30 contextual frames for understanding cognitism and the token associated with it. Each contextual frame is meant to communicate the idea of cognitism to a different conscious lens, filter, or worldview. While some of these sections may feel truthful to some minds and others not, they are all meant to communicate the same idea. This is meant to highlight how various conscious lenses distort actual truth from reaching our consciousness. And so I started the call with this. And yes, I get that you cannot write a document that creates the sensation of truth in every person who reads it. I get that. But I'm presenting an idea that is very far removed out of the way that we are currently thinking about things. And so I have to contextualize it or analogize it in a way that really is very loose and does not represent it well. So I told him, I said, yeah, that makes sense that you disagreed with it. And I read that because I'm like, yep, that's what I expected. But I also don't expect that most people can really consume the whole thing. And they probably shouldn't because it's incomplete and it's, from 2017. And I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but obviously I've shifted my focus to making video content instead of the written word. And I explained to Jim, part of the reason why is because a document is linear. The manifesto is a linear document. And so everybody reads the same thing first. And it's it just will not relate to every single person. You can't really present an idea that relates to every single person in the exact same way. So I changed how I'm approaching it. But it felt very ironic to read people and hear people saying that they thought that Jim disagreed with most of what I was talking about. after me and him talking about the fuzzy nature of language and how, when I say a sentence, the same thought that's in my mind doesn't end up in your mind, and that's the source of all of our errors in interrelating with each other. It's so funny to see so many of these people being like, this such a different interpretation to the experience that I just had actually talking to him for 90 minutes. So I've talked long. This video might be fucking long. Bye.